Parametric determinism refers to a Marxist interpretation of the course of history formulated by Ernest Mandel, and it could be viewed as one variant of Karl Marx's historical materialism or as a philosophy of history. In an article critical of the analytical Marxism of John Elster, Mandel explains the idea as follows. Dialectical determinism is opposed to mechanical, or formal logical determinism, is also parametric determinism. It permits the adherent of historical materialism to understand the real place of human action in the way the historical process unfolds and the way the outcome of social crises is decided. Men and women indeed make their own history. The outcome of their actions is not mechanically predetermined. Most, if not all, historical crises have several possible outcomes, not innumerable fortuitous or arbitrary ones. That is why we use the expression parametric determinism, indicating several possibilities within a given set of parameters. In formal logical determinism, human action is considered either rational, and hence logically explicable, or else arbitrary and random. But in dialectical determinism, human action may be non-arbitrary and determinate, hence reasonable, even although it is not explicable exclusively in formal logical terms. The action selected by people from a limited range of options may not be the most logical one, but it can be shown to be non-arbitrary and reasonable under the circumstances, if the total context is considered. What this means is that, in human situations, typically several logics are operating at the same time which together determine the outcomes of those situations. The logic of the actors themselves, the logic of the parameters constraining their behavior, the logic of the interactive relationship between actors and their situation. If one considered only one of these aspects, one might judge people's actions irrational, but if all three aspects are taken into account, what people do may appear very reasonable. Dialectical theory aims to demonstrate this by linking different logical levels together as a total picture, in a non-arbitrary way. Different logical levels means that particular determinants regarded as irrelevant at one level of analysis are excluded, but irrelevant and included at another level of analysis with a somewhat different set of assumptions, depending on the kind of problem being investigated. For example, faced with a situation, the language which people use to talk about it reveals that they can jump very quickly from one context to another related context, knowing very well that at least some of the inferences that can be drawn in the one context are not operative in the other context. That's because they know that the assumptions in one context differ to some degree from the other. Nevertheless, the two contexts can coexist, and can be contained in the same situation, which we can demonstrate by identifying the mediating links. This is difficult to formalize precisely, yet people do it all the time, and think it perfectly reasonable. For another example, people will say, you can only understand this if you are in the situation yourself, or on the ground. What they mean is that the meaning of the totality of interacting factors involved can only be understood by experiencing them. Standing outside the situation, things seem irrational, but being there, they appear very reasonable. Dialectical theory does not mean that, in analyzing the complexity of human action, inconvenient facts are simply and arbitrarily set aside. It means, rather, that those facets of the subject matter which are not logically required at a given stage of the analysis are set aside. Yet, and this is the point, as the analysis progresses, the previously disregarded aspects are integrated step by step into the analysis in a consistent way. The proof of the validity of the procedure is that, at the end, the theory has made the subject matter fully self-explanatory. Since all salient aspects have been given their appropriate place in the theory, so that all of it becomes comprehensible, without resort to shallow tautologies. This result can obviously be achieved only after the research has already been done, and the findings can be arranged in a convincing way. A synthesis cannot be achieved without a preceding analysis. So dialectical analysis is not a philosopher's stone that provides a quick shortcut to the fount of wisdom, but a mode of presenting findings of the analysis after knowledge has been obtained through inquiry and research, and dialectical relationships have been verified. Because only then does it become clear where the story should begin and end, so that all facets are truly explained. According to Ernest Mandel, Marx's method is much richer than the procedures of successive concretization or approximation typical of academic science in mainstream social theory. The problem of several logics in human action is dealt with by game theory, a kind of modeling which specifies the choices and options which actors have within a defined setting, and what the effects are of their decisions. The main limitation of that approach is that the model is only as good as the assumptions on which it is based, while the choice of assumptions is often eclectic or fairly arbitrary. Dialectical theory attempts to overcome this problem by paying attention to the sources of assumptions, and by integrating the assumptions in a consistent way. Brief explanation of the concept. One common problem in historical analysis is to understand to what extent the results of human actions can be attributed to free choices and decisions people made, and to what extent they are a product of social or natural forces beyond their control. To solve this problem theoretically, Mandel suggests that in almost any human situation, some factors are beyond the control of individuals, while some other conditions are under their control. Some things can under the circumstances be changed by human action, according to choice, but others cannot or will not be, and can thus be regarded as constants. A variable can vary, yet it cannot vary in any direction whatever but only within the given parameters. In a general sense, a parameter is a given condition imposed on a situation, or a controlled variable. But more specifically it refers to a condition which, in some way, limits the amount and type of variability there can be. Those given objective parameters which are beyond people's control limit the realm of possibilities in the future. They rule out some conceivable future developments or alternatively make them more likely to happen. In that sense, human action is determined and determinate. If that wasn't so, then it would be impossible to predict anything much about human behavior. Some of these parameters refer to limits imposed by the physical world, others to limits imposed by the social setup or social structure that individuals and groups operate within. The dominant ideology or religion could also be a given parameter. If, for example, most people follow a certain faith, this shapes their whole cultural life, and is something to be reckoned with that isn't easily changed. At the same time, however, the given parameters cannot usually determine in total what an individual or group will do, because they have at least some of personal or behavioral autonomy. They can think about their situation, and make some free choices and decisions about what they will do, within the framework of what is objectively possible for them. Sentient organisms, of which human beings are the most evolved sort, are able to vary their own response to given situations according to internally evaluated and decided options. In this sense, Karl Marx had written, "People make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. The past is not something which can be changed at all in the present, only reinterpreted, and therefore the past is a given constant which delimits what can possibly happen in the present and in the future. If the future seems relatively open-ended, that is just because in the time interval between now and the future, new options and actions could significantly alter what exactly the future will be. Yet the variability of possible outcomes in the future is not infinite, but delimited by what happened before." 10 implications. 10 implications of this view are as follows. At any point in time, the outcomes of an historical process are partly predetermined, and partly uncertain because they depend on what human choices and decisions will be made in the present. Those choices are not made in a vacuum, but in an environment which makes those choices possible, makes them meaningful and gives them effect. Otherwise they would not be real choices, only imaginary choices. While the past and the present rule out some courses of action, a human choice is always possible between a finite number of realistic options, which often enables the experienced analyst to specify the most likely scenarios of what could happen in the future. Some things cannot happen, and some things are more likely to happen than others. Once an important choice has been made and acted upon, this will have an effect on the realm of possibilities. In particular, it will shift to a greater or lesser extent the parameters delimiting what can happen in the future. Thus, once a train of events has been set in motion, it will foreclose other possibilities, and also it might open up some new ones. If masses of people make important new choices, whether in response to circumstances or in response to a new idea, a qualitative change occurs. In that case, most people begin to behave differently. The process of history is both determined, in that the given parameters delimit the possible outcomes, but also open-ended, insofar as human action can change the historical outcomes within certain limits. Human history-making is therefore a reciprocal interaction between what people do, and the given circumstances. To some extent at least, it is possible to predict with useful accuracy what will happen in the future, if one has sufficient experience, knowledge, and insight into the relevant causal factors at work as well as how they are related. This may be a work of science or sustained practical experience. In turn, future perspectives can importantly influence human action in the present. In historical analysis and portrayals, the analytical challenge is to understand what part of a course of events is attributable to conscious human actions and decisions, what part is shaped by the combination of given circumstances in which the human actors had to act, and what exactly is the relationship between them. Because the ability to prove historical assessments scientifically is limited, ideology, a mindset or a social mentality about the state of the world typically plays an important role in the perspectives people develop. With hindsight, it may be possible to trace out accurately why events necessarily developed in the way that they did, and not otherwise. But at the time they are happening, this is usually not, or not completely possible, and the hope for a particular future may play an important role. In addition, ideology influences whether one looks upon past events as failures or successes. There is no non-partisan history writing in this sense. At best we can say the historian had full regard for the known facts pertaining to the given case and frankly acknowledges his biases. History, in general, cannot be simply defined as the past, because it is also the past living in the present, and the future living in the present. Historical thinking is not just concerned with what past events led to the present, but also with those elements from the past which are contained in the present and elements that point to the future. It involves both antecedents and consequence, including future effects. Only on that basis can we define how people can make history as a conscious praxis. The main reason for studying history is not because we should assign praise or blame, or simply because it is interesting, but because we need to study past experience to understand the present and the future. History can be seen as a laboratory, the lab record of which shows how, under given conditions, people tried to achieve their goals, and what the results of their experimentations were. This can provide insight into what is likely or unlikely to succeed in future. At the very least, each generation has to come to grips with the experience of the previous generation, as well as educating the future generation. The theory of historicism, according to which the historical process as a whole has an overall purpose or teleology, is rejected. With Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, Mandel thought that history does nothing. It is people, real, living people, who do all that. History is not, as it were, a person apart using people as a means to achieve its own aims. History is nothing but the activity of people pursuing their aims, of course, with the proviso that people did so within given parameters not of their own making, allowing us to identify broad historical movements as determinate processes. The historical process is also not a matter of linear progress according to inevitable stages. Both progress and regress can occur, and different historical outcomes are possible depending on what people do. Perceptions and illusions. According to the theory of parametric determinism, the human problem in this context is usually not that human beings lack free choice or free will, or that they cannot in principle change their situation, but rather it is their awareness of the options open to them, and their belief in their own ability to act on them, influenced as they may be, by their ideology, experience and emotions. Perceptions of what people can change or act upon may vary a great deal. They might overestimate it or underestimate it. Thus, it may take scientific inquiry to find out what perceptions are realistic. By discovering what the determinism is, we can learn better how we can be free. Simply put, we could bang our head against a wall, but we could also go over the wall, through a door in the wall, or around the wall. At crucial points, humans can make history actively with a high awareness of what they are doing, changing the course of history. But they can also be made by history, to the extent that they passively conform to a situation which is mostly not of their own making and which they may not understand. As regards the latter, Professor Mandel referred to the condition of alienation in the sense of a diminished belief in the ability to have control over one's own life, or feeling estranged from one's real nature and purpose in life. People might reify aspects of their situation. They might regard something as inevitable or judge nothing could be done to prevent it, when the real point is that, for specific reasons, nobody was prepared to do anything about it. Something could have been done, but it wasn't. Thus, historical inevitability can also be twisted into a convenient apology to justify a course of events. In this process of making choices within a given objective framework of realistic options, plenty of illusions are also possible. Insofar as humans may have all kinds of gradations of awareness about their true situation, they may, as Mandel argues, not even be fully aware of what motivates their own actions, quite aside from not knowing fully what the consequences of their actions will be. A revolutionary seeking to overthrow the old order to make way for a new one obviously faces many unknowns. Therefore, human action can have unintended consequences, including effects which are completely opposite to what was intended. This means that popular illusions can also shape the outcomes of historical events. If most people believe something to be the case, even although it is not true, this fact can also become a parameter limiting what can happen or influencing what will happen. Skeptical reply. Because terrible illusions can occur, some historians are skeptical about the ability of people to change the world for the better in any real and lasting way. Indeed, postmodernism casts doubt on the existence of progress in history as such. If, e.g., Egyptians built the Great Pyramid of Giza in 2500 BC, and Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong landed on the Moon in 1969, this represents no progress for humanity. However, Mandel argued that this skepticism is itself based on perceptions of what people are able to know about their situation and their history. Ultimately, the skeptic believes that it is impossible for people to have sufficient knowledge of the kind that they can really change the human condition for the better, except perhaps in very small ways. It just is what it is. This skeptical view does not necessarily imply a very deterministic view of history. However, history could also be viewed as an unpredictable chaos, or too complex to fathom. However, most politicians and political activists at least do not believe that history generally is an unpredictable chaos, because in that case their own standpoints would be purely arbitrary and be perceived as purely arbitrary. Usually, they would argue, the chaos is limited in space and time, because in perpetual chaos, human life can hardly continue anyway. In that case, people become reactive beasts. Since people mostly do want to survive, they need some order and predictability. One can understand what really happened in history reasonably well, if one tries. Conscious human action, Mandel argues, is mainly non-arbitrary and practical. It has a certain logic to it even if people are not fully aware of this. The reality they face is ordered in basic ways, and therefore can be meaningfully understood. Masses of people might go into a mad frenzy. Sometimes that might be difficult to explain in rational terms, but this is the exception, not the rule. What is true is that a situation of chaos and disorder can powerfully accentuate the irrational and non-rational aspects of human behavior. In such situations, people with very unreasonable ideas can rise to power. This is, according to Mandel, part of the explanation of fascism.